Hey everyone, Willow here. Welcome back to Starting Out Solitary, and this week we are discussing the notable differences between those who practice in the Southern Hemisphere and those who practice in the Northern Hemisphere. I'll begin with the elemental representations of the directions. So both in the Southern and the Northern Hemisphere, we share West being represented by water and East being represented by air. The sun rises from the east and sets in the west. For me personally, to further have that connection and within the place that I'm living, when I go outside, the house faces the east, the direction of east, and so I feel a lot of the wind there. Not only that, we have some power poles as well, and just towards the east I do have a power pole right there in front of our house. So in the morning the birds fly in, which is a further representation of air. They also sit on the line and they have a bit of a chitter chatter, so again talking, that further representation of air. Also, where our property is positioned along the east, we have houses as well. So I do hear a lot of the neighbours chitting and chattering away, sometimes yelling, but that further represents the element of air for me. Now, west, again, the way our house is positioned, our water tank is on the west. But not only that, I have the ensuite, the laundry, the toilet and the bathroom as well that are positioned in the west. So again, there is that further connection with the element of water for west. Now, here in the Southern Hemisphere, the heat or the warmth generally comes from the north. So the Southern Hemisphere, we have fire representing north. For me, again, to further have that connection, I remember the first day when I set up my altar for the very first time, the sun was shining through the window, and so again, that was confirmation for me to have north as a representation, or to be represented by the element of fire. And it's a little thing that will always stay with me. Now, the park I have in the south, again, land, so that is that further connection of the element of earth for south. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't matter who says what direction is represented by what element. Take a look at what's going on where you live. What landmarks are there? You could be living near a beach, for example, and right in your direction of east, you may be facing the ocean. So, there is no right or wrong in having water, representing east for you. So, I feel that as long as you have that personal connection, that extra special something, that's the most important thing. Another notable difference is, of course, the seasons. Before I first started this spiritual path, I knew that, if it's winter here in the Southern Hemisphere, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's, generally summer. It changes depending on country and what have you. But funnily enough, when I first started reading books on paganism and witchcraft, I didn't realize at that time, I began with a lot of books written by Northern Hemisphere practitioners. And so I remember for the first time going to celebrate Yule, when in actual fact it was, summer here in the Southern Hemisphere. So it didn't make sense to have a log of fire on a day that was 40 degrees and over to celebrate Yule and what have you. So there wasn't that personal connection. And fortunately for me, not long after that, I realized that there were witches who practiced in the Southern Hemisphere, and there were authors of those practitioners that practiced here in the Southern Hemisphere, had written books, and it kind of put everything more into perspective. So I guess it's not until you put your theory into practice and feel out what it means to you, and if it's right for you, if it resonates with you, that's the way to go. That's the best thing to go about it. But I guess overall, practitioners who practice in the northern hemisphere and those who practice in the Southern Hemisphere, everybody practices differently. There are things where some people, it doesn't matter where you are from on this planet, they may resonate with the way you practice or the way you do things, or understand the way you do things, or what you believe in, or what have you. Even here, insofar as the Southern Hemisphere, I have friends who, although there may be some similarities, there are still a lot of differences as well. Things, for example, that I may see in nature that others who are practicing may not see the same thing. And there is no right or wrong. It's just the way, things are. I guess another thing that I incorrectly assumed, I used to think that those who practice in the Northern Hemisphere were more fortunate than us here in the South, because a lot of the commercial holidays, so for example, and I'm just going to use the term commercial just as a generalized term, kind of aligned with the Sabbats in the pagan world. So for example, Christmas, December, Yule, snow, whereas here in Australia, December, Christmas, hot, nothing to do with Yule whatsoever, although we could kind of relate to Christmas in July, around July being our really coldest time, especially here in Melbourne anyway. But yeah, and this was probably last year, Christmas time, I realized that it's actually difficult for those who practice in the Northern Hemisphere and having to constantly be faced with the Christianized holidays of Christmas, and not only that, but even losing touch of why Christmas was celebrated in the first place in comparison to how they spiritually practice and the way they honored Yule, around Christmas time. And so, I don't know, I guess we both have our pros and cons. It doesn't matter where we live. And again, it depends on our circumstances. It depends on our stories. It depends on our experiences. It depends on our family situations as well. I feel that sometimes I can be alone celebrating Christmas around, as I've mentioned previously, most of my family is Christian Orthodox. I'm very fortunate that my mum's not very rigid and very strict. She has always believed that, and this is probably where it's kind of stemmed from, but she's always believed that she doesn't need to go to church to believe in her God, and she doesn't believe in kissing the priest's hand and what have you. So she's not as strict. And I guess I can feel isolated during those times because seasonally I am celebrating Litha, and there is a lot of focus on Christmas here. But, having said that though, I do feel fortunate that that I am part of a coven, so I can celebrate with my magical family, and that makes me feel so much better. So, as I said, everybody has their pros and cons. But I think at the end of the day, whatever is that special magic something that you connect with that sings to your soul is the most important thing. Doesn't matter who says what or what you read. And sometimes, again, it's not until you put your theory into practice that you can further learn something about yourself or, discover that something special that really sings to your soul. So on that note, I will share a couple of reference books that helped me, and more so this will probably relate to those who are practicing in the Southern Hemisphere. I'll begin with this book. And this is written by Scott Alexander King, and I've said many a times in many of my videos, I do have such an appreciation and an honor and respect for nature and the wildlife and what have you. And before I ramble on, I do want to share this book. It's again written by Scott Alexander King. Sorry, I've always have all these things going on in my head, and it's Animal Dreaming. So the symbolic and spiritual language of the Australian animals. So pretty much if I am drawn to a particular animal, and it doesn't have to be out in nature, because some of the wildlife, the Australian wildlife, we won't see here in Melbourne. But this is a book that I reference, occasionally. It may be on the TV, it may be in a magazine, it may be in a newspaper, it may be something that pops up, on my phone or something, that I'm feeling is trying to tell me a message. So this is a book that I will refer to, and it just goes through the animals, a little bit about where they come from and what have you, and what the message may be. So it may give you some some insight, as I said. Okay, before I forget what's just popped into my head. So I am something late. there has been this thing the last few months that I'm trying to find a magical correspondence, for example, with all the plants. We've got so many beautiful wild native plants here in Australia, and a lot of the books have reference to the European plants and flowers and what have you for each season and their magical correspondences. And unfortunately, in this day and age, either some of the plants have been introduced here in Australia, or we can get some flowers or some herbs or what have you, from overseas. But there isn't that many books written on the magical correspondences of the native plants, here in Australia. So it's something that I'm wanting to really work on, and I have started on that a little bit, and I don't know where it's going to take me down the future. But yeah, the reason why I'm sharing that little bit is the next book that I'm going to show you, and it's Pagan Portals, Australian Druidry Connecting with the Sacred Landscape by Julie Brett. I cannot for the life of me remember how I stumbled across her. It was probably down one of my Google rabbit hole thingamajiggies. I bought this book for $12 at that time through Book Depository, $12 free postage, worldwide. And it's a great little read. It's about 101 pages, simple to understand, and I'll read the back a little bit. This book was a supplement to the study of Druidry and other nature-based spiritual paths as practiced in Australia, and discusses the difficulties in following a nature-based tradition in an environment very different from the place the tradition was created. Julie Brett is the founder of Druids Down Under and a spokesperson for Australian Druidry. She has been teaching and running public rituals based on exploring the Australian land through the traditions of Druidry since 2007. Her work has been influential to many forms of paganism through her work on the Wheel of the Year. So, absolutely love the little wallaby. Sorry, Mercury's in retrograde, so my words are coming out a bit funny. I love the little wallaby there. So again, this is a really good read. Another good read on the Wheel of the Year, and I like this book. This one's written by Frances Billinghurst, and it's called Dancing the Sacred Wheel. I don't know, I think I've mentioned this on one of my videos on my personal channel or here, I can't remember, it doesn't matter. But this kind of ties in a bit of Australian flowers and plants and what have you with the traditional witchcraft history as well. So it's got recipes in here for incense blends, for creative projects, and like. So, again, this is something that I do reference occasionally, and it kind of makes sense too. So again, if you're looking for something and you're in the Southern Hemisphere to kind of, start somewhere, a point somewhere within tying the changes and the seasons and all that with Australia in comparison to the way they did in the European ways, in the Northern Hemisphere, this is another recommended book. But for me, another thing is also, again, I'm wanting to have that deeper connection with the land that I'm living on here. So I was doing a little bit of research, and although I completely appreciate, understand, respect, and honor the Indigenous people, and that they're keeping everything, well, not everything, but a lot of the way that they practice, sacred to them, and it's completely understandable. I am wanting to find that that connection with the ancestors on this land before my time, before colonization and all that kind of stuff. And one of the places I started was to find who were the traditional owners of the land, and I didn't realize at this time, and this was something that I started learning and made more aware of when I did Laura Bowen's nature reading course, and I discovered that the Wurundjeri people were the traditional owners of the land here in Melbourne where I'm living. And so for the life of me, I cannot remember, it was probably one of the markets or something, I found this little booklet, and it's written by Jim Poulter, and I believe he's no longer with us, but I'll put some links to all of this that I'm making reference to anyway. I find this extremely fascinating, and when I had a look at that time through the website, there are other books that I'm wanting to purchase and have a read through, but this kind of further made sense, because even though our dates here in the southern don't correspond with the dates in the northern, I feel also that 100% the dates kind of still don't tie in with the Southern Hemisphere. And we do have this saying where we can have 4 seasons in one day here in Melbourne particularly. And that is the case. And then when I discovered this, it's one of those synchronistic divine intervention things. I'm like, I need some more information. There has to be something more. And, you know, I found this anyway. It talks about, you know, it shares a little bit about, you know, how they practice and what have you. I'll read the back of it. Previous attempts to define Aboriginal seasons in the Melbourne area have been unduly influenced by the European concepts for 4 seasons, each occupying a fixed 3-month period. Aboriginal society, however, worked on a 13-month lunar cycle, with each season relating not only to the prevailing weather but also to the particular human activities associated with each season. In close consultation with Wurundjeri elders, the author has identified 8 traditional seasons in the Melbourne area, each of which has predominant seasonal activity. And so I'll share a little bit, and it actually has a little bit of a diagram there. I don't know if I said this, but the traditional owners of the land vary, you know, throughout Australia even. So I just find this all fascinating, and it's such a beautiful thing. And so one of my missions has been to find that deeper, you know, connection. It feels like I'm missing something. But generally there is, I think it doesn't really matter where you're from. Everyone practices differently at the end of the day. Things that I see out in nature, other people won't, you know, other practitioners won't see the same thing, and that's totally fine. There is no right or wrong way, but I think at the end of the day, what is important is that you find your own personal connection and start somewhere, and, you know, and go with that flow. And yeah, you never know what you can learn and discover. On that note, a dear friend of mine, we did some foraging. We've been doing some foraging for the past couple of months, and so I am feeling really drawn to go out and create. So I am going to leave you, and until my next video, sending you so much love.